Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Lovell, who is the Joseph E. Levinson Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. His clinical interests include diagnostic evaluation and ongoing care of children with a wide variety of musculoskeletal problems, including MPS. Dr. Lovell has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed publications, and he has had continuous NIH funding for more than 25 years. Dr. Lovell, welcome.
Thank you. I want to thank the meeting organizers for the opportunity to present this afternoon. And also want to thank Dr. Linda Polgren at UCLA Medical Center, who did much of the pioneer research in the use of the treatments I'm going to talk about in kids with MPS. My approach to treatment of MPS came about at the invitation of the genetics team at Cincinnati Children's Hospital several years ago. They asked me to see a patient with MPS. And when I first got the request to see the patient, it caused me to review the literature and come to some grips as to why they would want me to be involved. And I'm going to share that information plus some information about why these treatments I'm going to talk about are relevant. And what the treatment is focused on is the inflammation that occurs in children with MPS as a consequence of the disease process that was very nicely described earlier this afternoon. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I guess I can do it. There we go. So this is a very simplistic explanation, but it all comes down to these accumulations of glycoprotein that are called GAGs that build up both inside the cell but also in the tissue outside the cell. And these GAGs can cause problems with the bone, cartilage, other tissues in the body in their own right by preventing the proper development and maturation of the tissue, but they also induce inflammation in the body. Our immune system is an exquisitely powerful tool to detect anything that's unusual in our body, whether it be a virus or a bacteria, a splinter in your arm, or these abnormal proteins, these GAGs. Your immune system says that shouldn't be there. And also the damage to the tissue that's caused by the GAGs, the immune system sees that as abnormal tissue. And so it stimulates the immune response, which is an inflammatory response. And the goal of that inflammatory response is to try to induce repair. Unfortunately, when you have a chronic abnormal condition such as MPS, where the GAGs don't go away, and the destruction to the tissue doesn't go away, then the inflammation becomes chronic. And there was research, and also then we see the symptoms of chronic inflammation in the body, such as pain and stiffness, fatigue, and other symptoms such as engages the central nervous system and that sort of thing. So the initial research that was relevant to why I became involved was studies done in animals where they looked at one of the primary instigators of inflammation in the body called tumor necrosis factor, It's abbreviated TNF. And what they saw was in animal models of MPS that TNF was elevated in those animal models. And if they used agents to block the effect of the TNF, then the animals improved and damage was able to be lessened. And so they concluded from these animal experiments that, at least in those animal models, elevation of TNF was important in the manifestations of the MPS. So in a human study in children with MPS compared to controls, and this is the first research study done by Dr. Polgren, it showed that in children with MPS, the levels of tumor necrosis factor in the blood is significantly higher than it is in age-matched controls. And more importantly, she looked in those children with MPS and correlated the elevation of the TNF with the severity of the symptoms. And what they found, or what she found, was higher levels of TNF in the blood were associated with more severe symptoms, such as muscle or musculoskeletal pain, fatigue. So she concluded that elevated TNF was relevant to the disease process. It's important to know that tumor necrosis factor really does its work inside the tissue, at the tissue level. So what you measure in the blood is really just kind of an indirect measure of what the TNF's true effect, which is in the tissue, which you can't measure very easily. So what we see is that even in children who have normal blood levels of TNF, they can still have significant problems with elevation of TNF inside the tissue where TNF truly does its work. So these are the symptoms that can be associated with chronic inflammation. And as we know, the immune system is throughout the entire body, head to toe, all the organs, including the central nervous system. So that if you have chronic inflammation due to MPS, then it can result in a wide range of symptoms. And if you look at the symptoms listed on the slide, you'll probably find many of them that are present in your own self or in your children. So it can be this inflammation induced by the disease process, the primary disease process of MPS can be, the inflammation can be very impactful, including the central nervous system. In fact, much of what we associate as damage associated with MPS can be from this chronic inflammation that's in addition to the primary problem of the enzyme deficiency. So it's also important to know that tumor necrosis factor is just one of a whole cascade of inflammatory mediators. We picked tumor necrosis factor because it tends to be for the immune system in chronic inflammation more like a conductor of the orchestra, so that TNF levels influence the levels of other inflammatory mediators. So when we picked out treatments to use to try to control this inflammation, we focused primarily on two treatments, both of which are biologic agents that are very commonly used in pediatric rheumatology. So adalimumab, the brand, one of the trade names is Humira, is a biologic that blocks TNF that we've used in children with arthritis for over 20 years. And anakinra blocks another important inflammatory mediator called interleukin-1. These are the two primary ones that were studied by Dr. Polgren in clinical trials. Anakinra is a much smaller molecule and does a much better job of penetrating the blood-brain barrier so it can get into the central nervous system. So in types of MPS in which there's CNS involvement, then we tend to use anakinra instead of the adalimumab. But both of these are biologic treatments that have very specific effects. Adalimumab binds to TNF very specifically. Anakinra binds to interleukin-1 very specifically. And both TNF and interleukin-1 are central to this chronic inflammatory process. So Dr. Polgren has done 2 clinical trials. The first one, or one of them was with adalimumab, and she did it in children with MPS II. As is appropriate when you're doing an experimental trial, it was done in patients who had long-standing disease, who had used standard treatment and still had significant problems. So the group of patients studied in this trial had very severe complications from their MPS II. And she put 25 patients who enrolled in this study. It was a 24-week open label study, meaning everybody got treated with adalimumab, and they and their physician knew they were. And then here's the improvements they saw with those treatments. So they looked at pain, they looked at joint stiffness, they looked at physical function, and they looked at energy and fatigue. And you can see that the large majority of these patients showed improvement in these measures in this open label trial. There were patients who didn't improve in this clinical trial. Since it's only 24 weeks in duration, there was no chance to look at how much improvement they may have had in damage, which was likely, if any at all, to be small. But more importantly, you need a longer study if you're going to look at the ability of these kinds of treatments to slow down or prevent complications of the inflammatory process. But at any rate, it was very promising that this treatment was able to improve these important outcome measures. This trial was designed in collaboration with patients with MPS II and their parents. And so the outcomes that were chosen to be looked at were the ones that families and patients found to be important. So these are relevant outcomes for families and patients, and the vast majority of patients showed at least some degree of improvement. This next trial is a trial of anakinra, and this was in MPS 3A, and it was again a short-term study, open label, looking at similar sort of outcome measures, and you can see that these patients showed, or the majority of these patients showed improvement in these outcome measures. Not all, but some. What I've been involved with families is using these 2 treatments in children with a variety of MPS subtypes. There's a number of unanswered questions at this point in time, and in all the patients that are in these clinical trials, all the patients I've seen have already had complications from their disease at the time we start the treatment. So, as was mentioned earlier with enzyme replacement therapy, the earlier you can start the treatment, the better the outcome. And I think the same thing may be true for the anti-inflammatory treatment. If you can start it early before complications such as contractures or bone or joint damage, and you can continue it for a long period of time, then perhaps you can minimize or avoid these complications by early introduction of anti-inflammatory treatment. But that hasn't been addressed formally, and my own experience hasn't allowed me to start treatment in children very early in the disease process. And we've just picked CHU and IL-1 and TNF as targets for intervention. I think they're good targets, but they're not the only ones. So for some types of MPS, interleukin-6 seems to be very important for contracture development. We have biologics that can block IL-6. So perhaps for those subsets of MPS, treatments that are blocking interleukin-6 may be more relevant for their disease problems. And there's also the inflammatory process includes a large number of inflammatory mediators that work in different ways, so that perhaps other types of anti-inflammatory approaches that we developed and have available would be more relevant than the ones we've thought about. So I think these are important questions. A few days ago, I went through clinicaltrials.gov and read about all the studies that are being done in MPS, and they're very exciting, especially the gene expression ones. But there's no studies looking at this anti-inflammatory approach, which I think will continue to be relevant. It's a known pathogenic mechanism of the disease. But at the current time, at least in clinicaltrials.gov, there's no trials or other kinds of observational studies listed looking at the effect of this kind of approach. My involvement in this has been as a clinician helping families try to help their kids. So I haven't done a formal study, but what I can share with you is comments provided to me by parents that I've worked with these treatments. And so these are actual statements that were sent to me at my request given by families to kind of describing their experience with what happens with this kind of treatment, at least for their child or young adult. So I'll not read those, but you can read them while they're sitting there. And then there's a young adult with Hunter's disease whose parents are at this meeting. And the mother told me that this morning he was able to complete the 5K, run and walk, which is quite an achievement. So these are experience of families I've worked with. And then in closing, I want to say thank you. The progress that's been made in this field has been a combined effort of investigators, patients and parents, and the clinical trials that I showed to you were designed in collaboration with Dr. Polgrim and patients and parents. And many of the individuals that are involved in this research are actually at this meeting and presenting on various aspects of the disease. So before I close, I've asked some of the families I treat to stand up so you can see them at the meeting. So once you look around, if you have interest in talking or interest in this kind of treatment, then you can talk to these families that have stood up here whose children have been treated with one of these two treatments. If you have an interest in moving forward with anti-inflammatory treatment in some type, my suggestion is to approach your genetic team and discuss it with them and see if they can be an advocate for you within the system to find somebody who's able, like a pediatric rheumatologist or an adult rheumatologist, if your son or daughter is a young adult, who's willing to discuss with you treatment options. So with that, I'll close, and I think we have time for a question and answer session with all the presenters. Thanks again for your attention.